Good evening, everyone. Welcome to World's Undercurrents. Imagine a world without America. No Hollywood blockbusters. No Coca-Cola. No jazz. No rock and roll. No hip-hop. No dollars. No Wall Street. No Silicon Valley. No iPhones. A world without the Declaration of Independence. Without the Constitution. Without a footprint on the moon. Chapter 1. A World Without America. A world where European empires still ruled as the center of the universe, Spanish galleons dominating the oceans, and Inca gold flowing only into the treasuries of Madrid. That world existed just 500 years ago, and absolutely no one could have imagined that on the wild, unforgiving shores of an unknown continent, amid poisonous swamps, swarms of mosquitoes, dense, hostile forests, and rugged cliffs, a nation would be born that would forever change the course of human history. Why there, of all places? Why these people? How did religious fanatics, runaway criminals, bankrupt aristocrats, desperate peasants and adventurers create the most successful republic in human history? What drove them to abandon everything and sail across an ocean that was then considered the edge of the world? And what invisible force turned their scattered, often feuding settlements into an empire stretching from sea to shining sea? We're going to break it down step by step. We'll see blood and glory, brilliant ideas and terrible mistakes, heroes and villains. We'll understand why America became exactly what it is today. But long before the first European ever set foot on these shores, a rich and incredibly diverse world already existed here. A world we still know surprisingly little about. Even though it was every bit as complex and vibrant as Europe at the time, between 15 and 18 million people inhabited the territory that would one day become the United States. They spoke hundreds of different languages, built large cities, waged wars, formed alliances, traded across thousands of miles, grew corn, squash, and beans, studied the stars, and created sophisticated systems of governance. In the Mississippi River Valley stood the great civilization of Cahokia, a city with up to 20,000 residents. Larger than London at the time, its people constructed enormous earthen pyramids rising as high as 10-story buildings. They conducted astronomical observations, held grand ceremonies, and fed thousands from fields that stretched to the horizon. In the Southwest, the Pueblo peoples built multi-story skyscrapers of stone and adobe in the desert. They engineered complex irrigation systems in places where rain might fall only once a year. In the Northeast, the Iroquois created the League of Five Nations, one of the most sophisticated democratic confederations in history, which would later directly inspire the Founding Fathers when they wrote the U.S. Constitution. This world was alive, vibrant, and ancient. And it was doomed. Not because it was weak or backward, but because events in 15th century Europe set in motion a chain reaction that would forever change the fate of two continents. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 cut off the traditional trade routes to the east. The price of spices skyrocketed tenfold. Pepper became more expensive than gold. European monarchs began desperately searching for new sea routes to India and China. It was this hunger for gold, spices, and glory that led to the discovery of a new continent. But no one at the time realized that along with the ships would come something far more devastating than cannons or steel. Chapter 2. America Before Columbus. Forgotten Civilizations. Before the first European ship appeared on the horizon, a vast, incredibly rich, and diverse world already existed across the lands we now call North America. a world that modern people know surprisingly little about, though it was every bit as complex, bright, and dynamic as Europe in the 15th century. Imagine a continent populated by 15 to 18 million people, more than the combined population of England, France, and Spain at that time. They spoke more than 300 different languages, about as many as are spoken across all of Europe today. These people were not savages as they would later be labeled. They built cities, constructed monumental structures, developed advanced farming systems, engaged in long-distance trade, formed alliances and fought wars, studied the stars, and passed down knowledge through countless generations. At the heart of the continent, in the broad Mississippi River Valley near present-day Illinois, stood one of the most impressive cities of pre-Columbian America, Cahokia. At its peak between 1050 and 1350, it was home to as many as 20,000 people. For comparison, London had only 15,000 to 18,000 residents at the time. Cahokia was the true capital of the region. Its inhabitants built massive earthen pyramids, or mounds. The largest, known as Monk's Mound, rose nearly 100 feet high, the height of a 10-story building. On its summit stood a great temple, or the chief's residence. More than 120 such mounds surrounded the city. The people of Cahokia grew corn, squash, and beans on vast fields stretching to the horizon. They traded seashells from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes, and obsidian from the Rocky Mountains. Grand ceremonies, religious festivals, and astronomical observations took place here. The city was carefully planned with wide plazas, straight streets, and artificial ponds. But around 1350 to 1400, Cahokia suddenly declined. The exact reasons remain unknown. Possibly climate change, soil exhaustion, internal conflicts, or disease. By the time Europeans arrived, only grass-covered mounds remained of what had once been a thriving metropolis. Far to the southwest, in the arid lands of modern New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado, the Pueblo peoples flourished. They constructed multi-story fortress cities made of stone and sun-dried adobe. Some settlements, like Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, contained up to 800 rooms and could house several thousand people. These buildings rose 5 or 6 stories high and featured sophisticated ventilation and water management systems. In a harsh desert where rain might not fall for years, the Pueblo created remarkable irrigation networks, canals, dams, and terraces. They grew corn, beans, and squash, and raised turkeys. Their society was highly organized, with clans, astronomer priests, and a complex social hierarchy. They left behind stunning rock art, beautifully patterned pottery, and evidence of extensive trade connections. In the Northeast, in the forests of what is now New York, Pennsylvania, and around the Great Lakes, lived the Iroquois. In the 15th century, they formed one of the most fascinating political systems in human history, the League of Five Nations, later 6 nations. It was a confederation of 5, and later 6, tribes: Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. Each tribe kept its autonomy, but major decisions were made collectively in a grand council where consensus was required. The Iroquois League featured a sophisticated system of checks and balances, a council of clan mothers who could remove chiefs, and clear rules for war and peace. Many historians believe this system directly influenced the Founding Fathers when they drafted the U.S. Constitution. Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson openly admired how the Iroquois had united different nations without sacrificing each one's independence. It was a living, dynamic world full of achievements, conflicts, art, and spirituality. People had lived here for thousands of years, developing unique cultures perfectly adapted to vastly different landscapes, from snowy northern forests to scorching southwestern deserts and humid southern swamps. But this world was doomed, not because of any weakness or backwardness, but because across the ocean in Europe, forces were gathering that would forever change the destiny of both continents. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 closed the old trade routes. Europe desperately sought new paths to the east. Soon, ships flying royal flags and crosses would cross the Atlantic. No European understood then that they were not simply discovering a new continent. They were bringing something far more destructive than guns or steel. Microbes against which Native Americans had no immunity whatsoever. It was this invisible force, disease, that would cause the greatest demographic catastrophe in human history. Chapter 3: The Columbian Exchange. Microbes that changed the world. When we talk about the discovery of America, we usually picture brave explorers, caravels with white sails, gold, spices, and the meeting of two worlds. But behind that romantic image lies the most terrible and most underestimated tragedy in human history. A tragedy scholars call the Columbian Exchange. In 1492, Christopher Columbus and his crew stepped onto the shores of the Caribbean islands. They brought with them not only crosses, swords, and the ambitions of the Spanish crown. Along with them came invisible passengers, bacteria, viruses, and microbes against which the native peoples of the Americas had absolutely no immunity. Imagine that first encounter. Europeans and Native Americans meet face to face. They exchange gifts, learn each other's words, and marvel at one another's appearance and customs. But in those very first days, even before any shots were fired or battles began, something far more destructive was already underway. One sailor coughed, one soldier sneezed, one sick sailor drank from a shared water source, and everything changed forever. Over the following decades, a massive biological exchange took place between the Old World and the New. From the Old World came smallpox, measles, influenza, plague, typhus, diphtheria, malaria, and yellow fever. From the New World went corn, potatoes, tomatoes, squash, beans, cocoa, tobacco, sunflowers, chili peppers, peanuts, and even syphilis. But the exchange was catastrophically unequal. For Europe, the new crops were a blessing. The potato saved millions from famine in Ireland and Germany. Corn and tomatoes enriched the cuisines of Italy, Spain, and France. Tobacco brought enormous profits. Europe's population began to grow rapidly. For the Americas, the incoming diseases were apocalyptic. Smallpox was the deadliest. It killed up to 90% of those who caught it. The disease spread faster than the Europeans themselves could advance inland. Entire villages died within weeks. Survivors were often left blind, disfigured, or sterile. There was no immunity because, after thousands of years of isolation, Native Americans had never encountered these Old World pathogens. Scholars still debate the exact numbers, but most modern research agrees that 80 to 95% of the indigenous population of the Americas died in the first 150 to 200 years after contact. On the territory of what would become the United States, the population fell from 15 to 18 million to roughly 1 to 2 million by the early 17th century. Some regions were almost completely depopulated. When English colonists arrived in Virginia and New England in the early 1600s, they found abandoned villages, overgrown fields, and forests reclaiming former settlements. They sincerely believed that God had cleared the land for them, making it empty and ready for settlement. They had no idea that just 1 or 2 generations earlier, these lands had been full of life. They were walking through the graveyard of entire civilizations. The fate of Cahokia and its surrounding cities was especially tragic. When Europeans finally reached the Mississippi Valley, they saw only huge grass-covered mounds. No one could believe that a city comparable in size to European capitals had once stood there. The same happened to many Pueblo settlements and Iroquois villages. Disease traveled ahead of the conquerors. Sometimes a single encounter with a trader or runaway sailor was enough for an epidemic to race hundreds of miles along rivers and forest trails. Native people, not understanding what was happening, tried to treat the sick with traditional herbs and rituals, which only accelerated the spread. The Columbian Exchange changed more than just population numbers. It radically altered the ecology of both continents. Europeans brought horses, cows, pigs, sheep, goats, and chickens. Horses completely transformed the culture of the Plains Indians. It was only after horses arrived that the famous mounted tribes like the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Comanche emerged. Pigs and cows changed the landscape by devouring native vegetation. New weeds and insects also arrived with the ships. But the greatest blow came not from metal or gunpowder, but from microbes. This is why, when we talk about the first English colonies, we must remember one crucial fact. The colonists were not conquering a densely populated continent. They were settling lands that had already been devastated by the greatest epidemic in human history. This invisible catastrophe created the empty space that allowed small groups of Europeans to gain a foothold on the coast and gradually push inland. Without the Columbian Exchange, the history of North America might have been completely different. We might be talking today not about 13 English colonies, but about powerful native confederations that successfully resisted European expansion. But history doesn't deal in what-ifs. Disease did its work. And when 3 English ships dropped anchor in Chesapeake Bay in 1607, the land before them was already a very different America, greatly depopulated, weakened, yet still full of dangers and possibilities. It was on these emptied but fertile lands that the story of those 13 colonies, which would one day become the United States, truly began. Chapter 4. Why the English? Spaniards, French, Dutch, and the English world. Why were the English the ones who ultimately founded the America we know today? After all, they weren't even the first to arrive. The Spanish landed in what is now the United States as early as 1565 and established St. Augustine in Florida, the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement on the continent. The French were actively exploring Canada and the Mississippi Valley. The Dutch built a thriving trading colony called New Amsterdam. So why did the English colonies become the core of the future United States? To understand this, we need to look at how each European power approached colonization. The Spanish came to the Americas with 2 main goals: gold and souls to convert to Christianity. They were searching for legendary riches like those they had found in Mexico and Peru. Conquistadors dreamed of cities paved with gold and quick glory. The Spanish crown strongly supported missionary work. Thousands of native people were baptized, and missions and forts were built across the land. But the Spanish rarely brought families with them. They created military outposts and missions rather than real towns meant for permanent settlement. Their model was imperial: conquer, convert, extract resources, and ship the wealth back to Madrid. As a result, they left behind relatively few permanent settlers and almost no self-governing communities on the territory of the future United States. The French took a different approach. They came primarily as fur traders. French explorers and coureurs de bois, woodsmen, formed close alliances with native tribes, often married native women, and adopted their customs and languages. They built small trading posts and forts along the rivers, but brought very few families and did little large-scale farming. France saw America mainly as a source of furs and a strategic buffer against England. Family-based colonies were almost non-existent. As a result, French presence remained thin across vast territories, from Quebec to Louisiana. The Dutch thought purely in commercial terms. Their colony of New Amsterdam, future New York, was first and foremost a business venture. The Dutch West India Company wanted profit from the fur trade and agriculture. The Dutch were relatively tolerant of different religions and nationalities. By the 17th century, 18 languages could already be heard in the streets. But they too had little interest in building a large permanent population. When an English fleet arrived in 1664, the residents, who were more accustomed to trade than to war, refused to fight. The city surrendered without a single shot and was renamed New York after the Duke of York. Now, the English. The English didn't come just to plunder and leave. They brought an entire world with them. They arrived with wives and children, cows and pigs, apple trees and wheat, English common law, the English language, and deeply rooted ideas about property, self-government, and religion. They came to stay. Why did they succeed where others didn't? First, in 16th and 17th century England, there were many people who felt crowded at home. Overpopulation in the countryside, religious persecution, economic hardship, and the closure of monasteries after the Reformation created a powerful wave of people eager for a fresh start. Unlike Spain or France, the English government didn't fund royal expeditions from the treasury. Colonies were created by private companies and joint stock ventures. People invested their own money and took real risks, so they were highly motivated to build something lasting. Second, the English brought women. From the very first, groups of settlers, there were families. This fundamentally changed the nature of the colonies. Children were born, new generations grew up who considered America their home. Real societies formed, not just temporary camps. Third, the English brought traditions of local self-government. Even in medieval England, there had been parliaments, jury trials, and the habit of solving problems at community meetings. These habits crossed the ocean with them. Even in the harshest conditions, colonists quickly formed assemblies, elected representatives, and passed laws. And finally, the most important factor, different groups of English came with very different motivations. In the South, profit-seekers, gentlemen, and adventurers who eventually found their gold in tobacco. In the North, religious dissenters, Puritans, and pilgrims who wanted to build a pure Christian society free from the corruptions of the Church of England. These two powerful forces, the drive for wealth and the drive for religious freedom, complemented each other and created tremendous energy for growth. While the Spanish searched for gold, the French for furs, and the Dutch for profit, the English were searching for a new life. They came not as temporary conquerors, but as builders for generations. They cleared forests, plowed fields, built homes, schools, and churches. They multiplied rapidly and steadily expanded their settlements. That's why when the first English colonies appeared along the Atlantic coast in the 17th century, they were fundamentally different. They weren't just military forts or trading posts. They were emerging societies with their own laws, religions, economies, and dreams. Of course, this English world also brought its dark sides. Rigid religious prejudices, a hunger for land, and frequent conflicts with native peoples. But it was this unique combination: families, self-government, religious passion, and entrepreneurial spirit that laid the foundation for the America that would one day challenge the mighty British Empire itself. Chapter 5. Jamestown. From Disaster to Tobacco Gold. The first English attempt to establish a foothold in the New World ended in total disaster. In 1585, a group of colonists led by Sir Walter Raleigh landed on Roanoke Island off the coast of present-day North Carolina. When a supply ship finally returned 3 years later, it found nothing but empty houses and the mysterious word Quoto ANN carved into a tree. The colonists had vanished without a trace. Historians still debate what happened to them. They may have died of starvation, been killed by native tribes, assimilated with local peoples, or perished in a storm. The lost colony served as a stark warning. The New World did not forgive mistakes or weakness. But failure only fueled the appetite of the English crown and investors. In 1606, King James I granted a charter to the Virginia Company of London, the first joint stock company created specifically for colonizing America. This was not a royal military expedition, but a purely commercial venture. Investors put up money hoping for quick and enormous returns. They dreamed of finding gold like the Spanish had in Peru, or at least discovering a short route to China and India. None of them were thinking about long-term settlement. On May 14, 1607, 3 small ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, dropped anchor in the broad Chesapeake Bay. 120 men and boys came ashore and chose a site for the first permanent English settlement in North America. They named it Jamestown, in honor of King James I. The choice of location was terrible. The peninsula was low and swampy, surrounded by brackish water teeming with mosquitoes. Malaria raged in summer, and cold dampness ruled in winter. But the colonists had no intention of farming. More than half of them were gentlemen, nobles or sons of nobles who had never held a shovel in their lives and considered physical labor beneath their dignity. They had come to find gold, not to plow fields. The first winter was a nightmare. By the spring of 1608, fewer than 40 of the original 104 people were still alive. Hunger, dysentery, malaria, and constant clashes with the Powhatan Indians claimed 2/3 of the colonists. The survivors ate their leather boots, rats, snakes, and there were even rumors of cannibalism. Archaeologists later found human bones in Jamestown with clear-cut marks. The colony was hanging by a thread. Salvation came from 2 very different directions. The first was John Rolfe, a young colonist who had survived that terrible winter. In 1614, he married Pocahontas, the daughter of the powerful Powhatan chief. This marriage brought a temporary peace between the settlers and the Indians. But something far more important happened. Rolfe brought back seeds of a special variety of tobacco from the West Indies. Europeans had already gone crazy for the plant. Smoking was believed to cure everything from the plague to melancholy. Prices in London were astronomical. Virginia's soil turned out to be perfect for growing tobacco. The plant grew quickly, required a lot of labor, but brought enormous profits. Within 10 years, tobacco exports from Virginia skyrocketed from a few pounds to £500,000 per year. Tobacco became Jamestown's gold. The colonists had finally found something worth risking their lives for. But growing tobacco demanded a huge workforce. The soil exhausted quickly, and plantations had to keep expanding. At first, the colonists tried to use poor Englishmen, indentured servants, who signed contracts for 7 years in exchange for passage to America. But there weren't nearly enough of them. Then, in August 1619, a Dutch ship sailed into Jamestown Harbor. On board were not goods or servants, but 20 and odd Africans captured from a Spanish vessel. These people became the first African slaves in English North America. Almost by accident, in the very same year and the very same place, two elements entered American history that would shape its destiny for the next 2.5 centuries: tobacco and slavery. In that same year of 1619, something else happened that is often forgotten. In a small wooden church in Jamestown, 22 delegates from all the Virginia settlements gathered. They created the House of Burgesses, the first elected legislative assembly in the New World. The colonists gained the right to make their own laws, collect taxes, and manage their internal affairs. Picture this striking paradox. In the same year, in the same colony, two opposite forces of American history were born almost simultaneously. On one side, a system of slave labor that would generate enormous wealth for the South. On the other, the first seeds of representative democracy that a century and a half later would help create the most successful republic in the world. Jamestown survived. Thanks to tobacco, it grew from a dying fort into a prosperous colony. But the price of that survival was incredibly high. Tobacco gold required more and more land and more labor. Conflicts with the Indians intensified, and the Africans who had been brought over gradually shifted from servants to slaves for life. So, in the swamps of Virginia, amid mosquitoes and tobacco fields, real English America was born. Tough, pragmatic, full of contradictions, yet remarkably resilient. At the same time, far to the north on the cold, rocky shores of Massachusetts, a very different group of people was landing with very different dreams. Chapter 6: The Paradox of 1619, Slavery and the First Democracy. The year 1619 became one of the most important and most contradictory years in early American history. In that year, in the small, barely surviving colony of Jamestown, two events occurred almost simultaneously that would shape the destiny of the future United States for centuries. Two events that still make historians debate and ordinary people reflect on the nature of the American experiment. It began on a hot August day in 1619. A battered Dutch ship called the White Lion slowly entered Jamestown Harbor. On board were not goods, not supplies, and not new settlers. On board were 20 and odd Africans, men, women, and children. They had been captured from a Spanish ship carrying enslaved people from Angola. The Dutch captain sold them to the Virginia colonists in exchange for provisions. Almost by accident, African slavery had arrived in English North America. At first, these people were called servants. Many worked under contracts like the white indentured servants and could potentially gain freedom after a few years. But things changed quickly. Tobacco plantations demanded more and more labor. Work in the tobacco fields was brutal, weeding, picking leaves under the blazing sun, drying and packing. There weren't enough white servants. Many died of disease, ran away, or refused to work after their contracts ended. Gradually, Africans began to be held for life. Their children also became the property of their owners. By the mid-17th century, a full system of racial slavery existed in Virginia. In that same year of 1619, just a few weeks after the White Lion arrived, a second event took place. One completely opposite in spirit. In a small wooden church in Jamestown, built from rough logs, 22 delegates from all the Virginia settlements gathered. These were planters, merchants, and farmers. They held the first meeting of the House of Burgesses, the first elected legislative body in the New World. The colonists had won the right to choose their own representatives, debate local laws, set taxes, and manage their internal affairs. Imagine the scene. In the same small settlement within just a few miles, two historic events occurred in the very same year. On one side, the arrival of the first Africans, which marked the beginning of the darkest chapter in American history, a system of slavery that would last nearly 250 years and lead to the bloodiest war ever fought on American soil. On the other side, the birth of the first representative democracy in America. People who had just survived starvation and death decided that they themselves would create the laws by which they would live. Without a king, without lords, without appointed officials, they would decide their own fate. This is the great American paradox that would haunt the country throughout its history. Freedom and unfreedom were born in the same year, in the same place, at almost the same time. Why did it happen this way? The Virginia colonists were pragmatists. They needed labor for their tobacco fields, and they took what was offered. At the same time, they wanted to protect their rights as Englishmen. They remembered the English tradition, no taxation without representation. They didn't want the company in London to control every aspect of their lives. So they created their own little parliament. The paradox of 1619 shows us America as it would be for centuries to come. A country capable of proclaiming the highest ideals of freedom while simultaneously building a system based on the exploitation of human beings. A country where the Declaration of Independence would declare that all men are created equal, while the Constitution would count a slave as 3/5 of a person. This paradox was not an accident. It was built into the very nature of the early English colonies. In the South, where tobacco, and later cotton, dominated, the economy required cheap and controllable labor. In the North, where small farms, fishing, and trade prevailed, slavery never took root on the same scale. Yet even in the South, many colonists sincerely saw themselves as fighters for freedom. They fought against tyranny from London, created elected assemblies, and defended their rights. At the same time, they failed, or refused, to see the contradiction in denying all rights to people simply because of the color of their skin. 1619 is not just a date in a textbook. It was the moment when two paths appeared in the emerging America, the path of freedom and the path of unfreedom. These two paths would run side by side, sometimes intertwining, sometimes clashing, until they collided in the deadliest war in the country's history in the mid-19th century. Jamestown survived and began to grow rich on tobacco and slave labor. But at the same time, just a few hundred miles to the north on the cold shores of Massachusetts, a very different group of people was landing. People who were not looking for profit, but for the chance to build an ideal Christian society. People who also dreamed of freedom, but of a very different kind. Chapter 7: The Pilgrims, the Mayflower, and the First Constitution. While Virginia in the South was slowly growing rich on tobacco and learning to live with the paradox of slavery and representative government, a very different drama was unfolding on the cold, harsh coast of the North. In September 1620, a small ship called the Mayflower set sail from the English port of Plymouth. On board were 102 passengers. These were not gentlemen seeking quick fortune, but Pilgrim Fathers, radical Puritans who believed the official Church of England had become too Catholic, too luxurious, and too corrupted by sin. They didn't want to reform the church from within. They wanted to leave and build a new, pure society where they could worship God according to their own conscience. The voyage across the Atlantic was a brutal test. For 66 agonizing days, the ship was tossed by waves, cramped, damp, and filled with sickness and fear. Some passengers died en route. When the Mayflower finally dropped anchor off Cape Cod on November 11, 1620, the passengers realized they were much farther north than the land granted to them by the Virginia Company. No English laws applied here. There was no governor, no judges, no royal officials. Among the men, the threat of mutiny was real. Many said, "There is no authority over us here. Every man can do as he pleases." It was in this critical moment that one of the most important documents in the history of democracy was born. Right there on board the ship, in a cramped cabin, 41 adult men signed the Mayflower Compact. It was a short but revolutionary text. They agreed to form a civil body politic and promised to create just and equal laws for the general good, to which they would all submit. Picture the scene: a group of exhausted, half-starved refugees in the middle of a stormy ocean, with no king, no army, no officials, and no external authority. They voluntarily decided that they themselves would be the source of their own power. They would create the laws, and they would obey them. This was the first written civil constitution in history, based not on the will of a monarch, but on the consent of the governed. In that small document already lay the seeds of the future Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. The idea that power comes from the people, not from above, was written there in plain words. After signing the agreement, the Pilgrims went ashore and founded the settlement of Plymouth. The first winter was a nightmare. Cold, scurvy, hunger, and disease took nearly half the colonists. The survivors buried the dead at night so the Indians wouldn't see how few of them remained. By the spring of 1621, only a little more than 50 people were still alive. Then something happened that sounds like a Hollywood script. A man walked out of the forest who spoke to them in perfectly understandable English. His name was Squanto, or Tisquantum. His life story is one of the most remarkable in early American history. Years earlier, Squanto had been kidnapped by English sailors, sold into slavery in Spain, miraculously escaped to London, learned English, and after many years, made his way back home. When he finally returned, he discovered that his entire tribe, the Patchett, had been wiped out by smallpox brought by Europeans. He was the only one left. Squanto became the Pilgrims' savior. He taught them how to plant corn using fish as natural fertilizer, showed them where to catch eels, how to hunt deer, and which plants were safe to eat. Thanks to his help, the colonists were able to harvest their first successful crop in the fall of 1621. In thanks for that harvest, the Pilgrims held a 3-day feast. They invited the chief of the neighboring Wampanoag tribe, Massasoit, and about 90 of his warriors. For 3 days, they shared venison, wild turkey, corn, pumpkin, and other gifts of the land. This feast became known as the First Thanksgiving. Although today's Thanksgiving looks very different from that autumn celebration in 1621, the symbol remains the same: gratitude for survival, for the harvest, and for help that came in the darkest hour. But that moment of peace was only a brief flash of light in a long history of conflict. The Pilgrims survived, yet their small colony remained very vulnerable. Over time, Plymouth merged into the much larger and stronger Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Mayflower Compact was more than just a survival document. It became a powerful symbol. It showed that even a small group of people, completely isolated, could create the foundations of self-government and civil society. The idea that people can agree among themselves on the rules by which they will live became one of the defining features of American political culture. While the Pilgrims struggled for survival in Plymouth, a much larger wave of settlers was preparing to head north to the Massachusetts Bay Area. In the 1630s, the Great Migration brought more than 20,000 Puritans across the ocean. These people brought not only the Bible and strict religious beliefs, but also a firm conviction that God had called them to build a perfect Christian society on this new land, a city upon a hill that the eyes of the world would be upon. Chapter 8: The Puritans, a city upon a hill. Following the small group of pilgrims who barely survived in Plymouth, a true Great Migration poured onto the shores of Massachusetts Bay in the 1630s. More than 20,000 Puritans left England and crossed the ocean. It was one of the most organized and largest waves of migration in early American history. Unlike the Virginia colonists who mostly sought profit, the Puritans came with a high religious mission. They believed the Church of England was hopelessly corrupted by Catholic remnants and royal power. They didn't want to simply reform it. They wanted to build an entirely new, pure Christian society that would serve as an example to the entire world. The leader of this migration was John Winthrop, a talented lawyer and deeply religious man. Before sailing on the ship Arbella, he delivered the famous sermon, A Model of Christian Charity, in which he said, "We shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. If we are faithful to our covenant with God, He will bless us and make us glorious. But if we break that covenant and give ourselves to greed, pride, or injustice, we shall be cursed, and our name will become a byword." The Puritans sincerely believed that God had made a special covenant with them. They were the new chosen people, a new Israel, tasked with creating an ideal Christian society in the New World. The success or failure of the colony, in their view, depended not on economics, but on moral purity and obedience to God. The society they built in Massachusetts was very far from our modern idea of freedom. It was a true theocracy. Church and state were almost one and the same. Only full church members, those who could publicly testify about their personal religious conversion, had the right to vote or hold office. Missing Sunday service brought a fine. Blasphemy, adultery, and even disobedience to parents could lead to severe punishment, and in extreme cases, banishment or death. The Puritans were extremely intolerant of dissent. They banished Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson for dangerous religious views. They strictly controlled clothing, behavior, entertainment, and even holidays. Christmas was long considered a pagan festival and was banned. But this strict system had another very important side. The Puritans deeply believed in education. They felt every person should be able to read the Bible themselves. So they introduced compulsory elementary education for children. In 1636, just 6 years after Boston was founded, they established Harvard College, the first institution of higher learning in North America. The goal was simple: to train educated ministers and teachers so that faith would not die out in the next generation. They also valued hard work, discipline, thrift, and personal responsibility. These qualities later became known as the Protestant work ethic. It would become one of the most important engines of American capitalism and economic success. The Puritans believed that success in business was a sign of God's blessing, while laziness and wastefulness were sins. Despite its harshness, the Massachusetts Bay Colony grew and strengthened quickly. Boston became an important port and trading center. Colonists built farms, mills, shipyards, and schools. They created the system of town meetings, where residents directly discussed and decided local issues. This tradition of local self-government became one of the foundations of American democracy. However, iron discipline and religious intolerance could not remain unchallenged for long. Inside the city upon a hill, people began to appear who questioned the very idea of forcing belief. They argued that true faith could not be imposed by force and that church and state should be completely separate. One of the clearest voices belonged to a young minister named Roger Williams. His story would show how the first seeds of genuine freedom of conscience began to sprout even from the strictest theocracy. Chapter 9: The Birth of Freedom. Roger Williams and Freedom of Conscience. Inside the strict and disciplined city upon a hill of Massachusetts, cracks began to appear very quickly. The iron religious discipline that the Puritans saw as the key to their survival and God's blessing became an unbearable prison for some. The brightest and most dangerous voice of dissent was a young minister named Roger Williams. He arrived in Massachusetts in 1631 and almost immediately began saying things that seemed like pure madness to the colony's leaders. Williams asserted three revolutionary ideas for his time. First, he said that people could not be forced to believe. The church had no right to punish anyone for their religious convictions. Even if a person was wrong in their faith, that was a matter between them and God, not the state. Second, he insisted that church and state must be completely separate. Ministers should not hold government positions, and government should not interfere in church affairs. And third, the most dangerous statement for the colonists of that time, Williams openly declared that the English king had no right to give away Indian land because that land rightfully belonged to the native peoples. He believed colonists should honestly purchase land from the Indians rather than simply take it by royal charter. To Puritan leaders like John Winthrop, such words were not just heresy, they were a direct threat to the entire city upon a hill project. If Williams was allowed to continue, the whole system of religious control would collapse, and the colony would lose God's blessing. In 1635, Roger Williams was brought to trial. He was accused of spreading dangerous opinions. The court ordered him banished from the colony. The sentence was especially cruel. He was to be sent back to England on the first ship. In the middle of a harsh New England winter, that meant almost certain death. Williams fled Boston in the middle of a blizzard. For several months, he wandered through the forests, nearly dying from cold and hunger. He was saved by the Indians, the very people whose rights he had so fiercely defended. They gave him shelter, food, and allowed him to survive the winter. In the spring of 1636, Roger Williams and a small group of followers bought land from the Narragansett Indians and founded a new settlement. He named it Providence, in honor of God's providence that had saved him in his darkest days. This is how the colony of Rhode Island was born. From the very first day, Providence was a completely different place. Williams proclaimed a principle that sounded revolutionary in the 17th century: complete freedom of religion for everyone. Protestants of all denominations, Catholics, Jews, and even those who did not believe in God at all could live here. No one could be persecuted or punished for their religious beliefs. Rhode Island became the first place on earth where freedom of conscience was officially established and where church and state were completely separated. There was no mandatory church attendance, no religious taxes, and no punishment for dissent. Of course, such radical tolerance provoked fury from its neighbors. Massachusetts and Connecticut repeatedly tried to subdue or destroy the heretical colony. But Rhode Island survived. Over time, people who were persecuted elsewhere began to flock here. Quakers, Baptists, Jews, and everyone seeking true religious freedom. Roger Williams lived a long life and remained true to his principles until the end. He continued to defend the rights of the Indians, learned their languages, and even wrote the first book on the Narragansett language. He died in 1683, never seeing how widely his ideas would spread across the world. But the seeds he planted proved incredibly resilient. The idea of separating church and state and complete freedom of conscience, first loudly proclaimed in Rhode Island, would become one of the cornerstones of the American Constitution a century and a half later. Roger Williams was the first person in the New World to say what Thomas Jefferson would later repeat: a wall of separation between church and state. The story of Roger Williams reveals an important truth about the American experiment. Even in the strictest and most intolerant colony, there were always people willing to risk everything for the idea of freedom. And those voices, though first banished and persecuted, ultimately proved to be the most influential. While the North argued about the nature of true faith and the limits of freedom, a very different America was being born in the middle of the Atlantic coast, pragmatic, multilingual, and focused on trade. Chapter 10: The Melting Pot, New York and Pennsylvania. While the Puritans in the North were building their strict city upon a hill, and the Virginians in the South were growing rich on tobacco and slave labor, a completely different kind of America was emerging in the middle of the Atlantic coast. Pragmatic, multi-ethnic, and driven by trade and practical freedom. In 1664, an English fleet approached the shores of the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam. The city stood on the southern tip of Manhattan Island, a perfect, well-protected harbor. The Dutch governor Peter Stuyvesant, a tough and determined man with a wooden leg, wanted to fight. But the residents, who were far more accustomed to trade than to war, refused to support him. They understood that resistance would only bring destruction and loss. The city surrendered without a single shot fired. New Amsterdam was renamed New York in honor of the brother of King Charles II, the Duke of York. The Dutch trading post had become an English colony, but from the very beginning, New York was different from Massachusetts or Virginia. If the North was built on religion and the South on tobacco and plantations, New York was built on business, trade, and practical tolerance. By the mid-17th century, 18 different languages could already be heard on the city's streets. Dutch, English, French Huguenots, Jews, Swedes, Finns, Africans, both free and enslaved, and even a small number of Native Americans lived there. Unlike Puritan Boston, strict religious uniformity was not required. The Dutch had always been relatively tolerant, and the English kept that tradition after taking the city. Nationality and faith mattered far less than the ability to do business, trade, and make money. New York quickly became a noisy, energetic port and a true melting pot. You could buy goods from all over the world: Chinese silk, Caribbean sugar, African ivory, Virginia tobacco. The city thrived on trade, shipbuilding, and commerce. It was here that some of the first traits of the future American character began to form: business savvy, pragmatism, and a willingness to accept people from different cultures as long as they were ready to work and contribute. A little further south, in 1681, another unique colony was born: Pennsylvania. Its founder was William Penn, the son of an English admiral and a prominent member of the Quaker religious sect. The Quakers were one of the most persecuted groups in England. They refused to remove their hats before the king, rejected titles, opposed violence and war, spoke out against slavery, and believed that every person, regardless of race or background, carried an inner light of God. King Charles II owed Penn's father a large sum of money. Instead of repaying the debt in cash, he gave the son a huge tract of land west of the Delaware River. Penn named it Pennsylvania Penn's Woods. Penn called his project the Holy Experiment. He wanted to create a society based on Quaker principles: peace, justice, equality, and religious tolerance. He personally designed the plan for the capital city, Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. The streets were wide and straight to prevent fires and disease. Houses had gardens, and public buildings were planned with the future in mind. Unlike most other colonists, Penn honestly paid the Indians for their land. He signed treaties with them that were respected for decades. The Quakers were pacifists and refused to carry weapons, so relations with local tribes remained peaceful for a long time. Pennsylvania quickly became one of the fastest growing and most attractive colonies. People poured in from all over Europe: Germans, Scots-Irish, Welsh, and French. There was no religious persecution. The land was fertile and taxes were low. German farmers brought advanced agricultural methods, and Scots brought skills in weaving and trade. Philadelphia soon became the second largest city in the English colonies after New York. By the end of the 17th century, three very different types of English colonies had formed along the Atlantic coast. New England, a world of religion, education, and strict morality. The Middle Colonies, a world of trade, ethnic diversity, and practical tolerance. The Southern Colonies, a world of large plantations, aristocracy, and slave labor. Despite all their differences, a shared identity was slowly beginning to form among them. People called themselves English less and less often, and Americans more and more often. They had grown used to living 3,000 miles from London, where there was no king looking over their shoulder, no lords, and no bishops. Here, if you are hardworking, determined, and lucky, you could rise higher than you ever could in the old world. This mixture of different traditions, religions, and economic models created tremendous energy. It was this energy that, a few decades later, would allow the 13 very different colonies to unite against a common threat and create a new nation. But before that could happen, the colonies would have to go through a major test, the first truly global war in which they would play a significant role. Chapter 11. The 13 Colonies, already almost one nation. By the beginning of the 18th century, 13 English colonies had fully taken shape along the Atlantic coast of North America. They were incredibly different, almost like separate countries united only by a common language, shared traditions of English law, and formal loyalty to the king in London. In the north, in New England, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, lay a world of tough farmers, fishermen, and shipbuilders. Small farms, dense forests, and cold winters dominated the landscape. Towns were governed through famous town meetings, open gatherings where every free resident could speak and vote on local issues. People here valued education, discipline, and independence. Boston became the intellectual and commercial center of the region. In the Middle Colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, the most diverse and dynamic part of English America flourished. Trade boomed, large port cities grew, and on Pennsylvania's fertile lands, German and Scots-Irish farmers harvested rich crops of wheat. Philadelphia and New York were already competing to be the largest cities in the colonies. Many languages were spoken here, many religions were practiced, and strict Puritan rules mattered the least. This was a true melting pot, where nationality meant far less than the ability to work and do business. In the South, Virginia, Maryland, North and South Carolina, and Georgia stretched a world of vast tobacco and rice plantations. Here, the aristocracy ruled. Wealthy planters who lived in grand mansions, surrounded by fields worked by hundreds of slaves. Southern society was more hierarchical, conservative, and focused on export. Wealth was measured by the amount of land and the number of slaves a man owned. Formal education was valued less, but hospitality, honor, and loyalty to tradition were held in high regard. Despite all these differences, something shared was gradually forming between the colonies. A growing sense that they were no longer simply English. Living 3,000 miles across the ocean from London, people had grown used to doing things their own way. There was no king, no lords, and no bishops who could directly impose their will. Governors appointed from London often faced resistance from local assemblies. Colonists increasingly said, "We are English by blood, but American by spirit." They began to realize they shared common interests, common problems, and a common destiny. Trade connected the colonies more strongly than any laws. Ships from Boston carried fish and lumber to the West Indies and returned with sugar and molasses. New York and Philadelphia traded grain and flour. Virginia and the Carolinas sent tobacco and rice to England. A single economic system was slowly emerging. Young people from different colonies met in colleges, at fairs, and in the army during joint campaigns. The ideas of the Enlightenment also played an important role. The writings of John Locke, Montesquieu, and other European thinkers about natural rights, separation of powers, and the social contract spread through books, newspapers, and letters. Colonists read, debated, and increasingly applied these ideas to their own lives. They began to believe they deserved the same freedoms as people living in Britain itself. By the mid-18th century, many already felt they were no longer just scattered settlements, but one people. Not yet a full nation, but something much more than simple colonies. They had grown used to self-government, to the idea that hard work and determination could lift a person up, and to having fewer class barriers than in Europe. This slowly forming American identity was still fragile. It could have been destroyed by internal conflicts between North and South, between religious zealots and merchants, or between those who wanted full independence and those who remained loyal to the crown. But soon an external force appeared that unintentionally united the colonies more strongly than any sermons or trade ties ever could. To the west, beyond the Appalachian Mountains, lay vast territories claimed by France. The French built forts, traded furs with the Indians, and had no intention of letting the English into the fertile Ohio River Valley. Conflict was inevitable. In 1754, a 22-year-old major in the Virginia militia named George Washington was sent into the wilderness to deliver an ultimatum to the French. That small mission ended in a skirmish and a humiliating surrender at a hastily built stockade called Fort Necessity. No one knew then that this minor clash in the American woods would spark the first truly global war in human history, the 7 Years' War. It was that war, known in America as the French and Indian War, that would radically change everything. It would make the colonies stronger, teach them to fight side by side, and at the same time plant the seeds of future conflict with London. Chapter 12, The Spark of War, the 7 Years' War, and George Washington. By the middle of the 18th century, the 13 English colonies already felt like something more than mere overseas possessions of Britain. But their rapid growth was bound to collide with another European power that also claimed the heart of the continent. Beyond the Appalachian Mountains, in the vast Ohio River Valley, lay fertile lands covered with dense forests. Both the English and the French claimed this territory. France, with its strong forts stretching from Quebec to New Orleans, actively traded furs with native tribes and had no desire to let British settlers move west. The Indians, for their part, saw the English as the greater threat to their lands and viewed the French as more reliable partners. Tensions rose steadily. In 1754, the governor of Virginia sent a young 22-year-old major in the Virginia militia named George Washington into the deep woods to deliver an ultimatum to the French. Leave the Ohio Valley. Washington, tall, strong, and full of youthful ambition, marched hundreds of miles through nearly impassable forests. When the French refused to withdraw, fighting broke out. The young major hastily built a small fort he named Fort Necessity. The French and their Indian allies surrounded it. After a short siege, Washington was forced to surrender and retreat. It was his first military defeat. No one could have guessed that this small skirmish in the American wilderness would become the spark that ignited the first truly global war in human history, the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. The war quickly spread far beyond America. It engulfed Europe, India, the Caribbean, the Philippines, and even parts of Africa. In America, it was called the French and Indian War. On one side fought the British and their colonial militias. On the other, the French and most of the Indian tribes who saw the English as the main danger. For the colonies, this war became a real school. Thousands of American men fought side by side with professional British troops for the first time. They saw how the Redcoats fought, learned forest warfare tactics, discipline, and cooperation. George Washington, despite early setbacks, proved himself a brave and determined officer. He served throughout the war, took part in major battles, and gained invaluable experience. In 1759, the British won a decisive victory at Quebec. The French army was defeated. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain emerged as the complete victor. France lost almost all its possessions in North America. Canada and all territory east of the Mississippi now belonged to the British Empire. It seemed the colonies should have been celebrating. The French threat was gone. Western lands were now open for settlement. But victory came at a tremendous cost. Britain's national debt had skyrocketed. London was on the edge of bankruptcy. In Parliament, the reasoning was simple and harsh. We fought for the safety of the colonists. We protected them from the French and the Indians. Now it's time for them to help pay the bills. The colonists saw it very differently. During the war, they had felt their own strength. They had fought alongside the best soldiers of the empire and realized that the Redcoats were not invincible. They had learned to fight, to lead, and to survive under difficult conditions. Many American officers, including Washington, began to look at British generals with less awe. When London introduced the Stamp Act in 1765, attacks on every newspaper legal document, and even deck of playing cards, a wave of anger swept through the colonies. It wasn't even about the amount of money. The sums were relatively small. It was about the principle, no taxation without representation. This slogan began echoing in every tavern from Boston to Charleston. The colonists rightly protested. They had no representatives in the British Parliament, yet they were being forced to pay taxes. They considered themselves free Englishmen, entitled to the same rights as people living in Britain. The 7 Years' War, which was supposed to strengthen the British Empire, actually weakened the bond between London and the colonies. It made Americans more confident, more united, and more determined to defend their rights. Young George Washington returned home a hero. He married, became a successful planter, and a respected member of Virginia society. But the war had changed him. He was no longer a naive young man. He had seen the weaknesses of the British Empire and begun to understand that Americans were capable of far more than simply being obedient subjects. The spark that had ignited in the forests of Ohio in 1754 continued to smolder a few years later. It would burst into the full flame of revolution. Tension between the colonies and the mother country grew with every passing year. In Boston, which had become the true center of resistance, events were about to unfold that would forever be remembered as symbols of the struggle for freedom. We've now reached the very brink of revolution. The spark has been lit, and soon it will burst into a flame that will forever change the course of history. What happens next? Can a scattered group of colonies really defeat the mightiest empire on Earth? How will a new nation be born? And what dangerous contradictions are already hidden in its very foundation? All of that awaits us in part 2. If you enjoyed this first part, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the continuation. Thank you for watching World's Undercurrents. See you very soon in part 2.